Since this is my first review video, let me take a moment to establish a few things about how I evaluate a book. Does it entertain me? Yep, that's all the criteria I really have. I don't care if the language used is simple or complex, hyper-detailed or barely detailed. I've read books from virtually every genre, and as long as the pacing is decent, so slightly faster than a snail's pace, I can typically hang in there until the end. As long as the person is a little less detailed than Dickens, I'm fine with it. I do tend to favor books, within fiction at least, that focus on telling a story more than delivering a message. So no Ayn Rand's grace my bookshelf. Mostly because if I'm looking to dive into an academic topic, I'll find an academic book or paper to read about it. I can appreciate the value people find in books that heavily hit philosophical issues, but that's rarely what I choose to dedicate leisure time to, at least at this point in my life. It's pretty subjective whether a person feels like a book is more message than story, though I actually enjoyed reading Siddhartha, but I feel like it's a well-told story with a message at its heart rather than a half-told story serving as a means to deliver a message. Basically, I just don't like things that are overly preachy without having a good story. I really don't care if they try to deliver a political message one way or the other if the story's entertaining. Like, I think both 1984 and Brave New World are fantastic books, and they're very much books with a message. I also don't force my way through books I don't like. If it hasn't caught my attention by about page 50, I just drop it. So, as you can probably guess, if I'm doing a review of an author, I probably like that author. That doesn't mean I'll act like they're perfect, but if I didn't enjoy the books, why would I take time out of my day to complain about them? It'd be one thing if I was mentioning that I really didn't like a new book that an author has put out, but that would probably be a YouTube short rather than a full-length review video. If I'm going to actually dedicate the time to make a review video, then it's going to be about someone I like. So I guess it's not really a review so much as a recommendation, but I like the word review better. Will Wight, the person. I'm just going to establish early on that I'm not diving into the authors themselves all that much. Might know a few details about exactly how they have worked, but other than that, I'm not diving into their personal life. I don't have anything against him, and the one interaction I actually had with him, which was really brief, and back when he still did a lot of communication on his personal website, it was very friendly and cordial, so he seems like a friendly fellow. I just don't think an author's personality is terribly relevant to the quality of the person's work. I'm not going to go into a separate the art from the artist style screed, but it's really easy to not even have to try and separate the two if you just don't put the time in to try to learn much about the artist to begin with. Regarding his work, the word prolific fits him really well. He can pump out books like he's a machine. These aren't giant behemoth of books, so they're not multi-thousand pages. They are still moderately lengthed books, but they read very, very quickly. His works read really smoothly, and it's really easy to just turn everything off and enjoy the tale you are being told. They aren't overly complicated with dozens of characters to keep track of, though Cradle gets progressively more complex, but it's more of an exception than the rule when it comes to his works, so we'll talk a little bit more about that when the time pops up. And I also don't really think it would be possible to tell a story across 12 books and not have the overall story pick up a little bit of complexity. The magic systems that he creates tend to be on the simpler side and are pretty easy to grasp almost the moment they appear. Yet again, Cradle is a bit of an exception, but we'll dive into that at the appropriate part of the video. For comparison, I would say Lord of the Rings actually lands on the more complex side of fantasy series rather than on the simpler side. So I'm not really talking about complexity in the sense that it's just straight up difficult to read. I'm talking about complexity in the sense that there's a lot going on and a lot of characters. So to throw a sci-fi series out there that would be complex, Dune is complex. At least once you get past the first book, although I guess some people would argue even the first book is pretty complicated. Whereas the Sword of Truth series would be maybe one that's not quite so complicated but still has a very long series of books attached to it. It's also not really a big financial investment to try out Will Wight's stuff, at least if you're willing to read ebooks. I guess that's true if you're willing to read ebooks in general, but for Wight at least, the first book in each series is pretty cheap on Kindle, if not outright free if you have Kindle Unlimited, and that is also true for a lot of his books and not just the first in each series. I might dive into the whole ebook versus physical book thing at another point in time, but for now I'll just say that my book consumption would be a lot lower if I were still exclusively reading physical books. Will Wight, probably unsurprisingly at this point, is a definite recommended author from me. I think he's both an excellent introduction to fantasy in general, and a fun author to read if you already have an established love for fantasy. His works sit right at that point where they could be cataloged as young adult, but not be so young adult that a regular adult has a hard time enjoying them. The fact that he started out independent and turned out to be as good as he is was what actually inspired me to buckle down and finish writing my own book and put it out, though I'm not even trying to imply that I'm remotely on the same level as him. More to the point, independently published authors on Amazon had a bit of a stigma for a long time, and still do to purists that turn their nose up at ebooks. Mr. Wright is someone that would have absolutely been capable of being published the traditional way, but published independently at the start. This is also one of the reasons I chose to start with him. Good authors can start this way, and even if you don't succeed, you can't really know until you try. Wright has pretty handily demonstrated that there's zero reason to put off trying. As far as I'm aware, his success was pretty fast. Like, his first book sold really well enough for him to be able to actually dedicate the time to stay primarily writing. Alright, now to dive into the book series. Traveler's Gate. The Traveler's Gate trilogy is set in a universe where individuals get their magical powers by being connected to places called territories. For the most part, this has to be a connection they are born with. There are exceptions, like one of the main characters, but I'm not going to dive into too much detail there. These people are called travelers and are immensely more powerful than the average person. This was Wight's first series, that I'm aware of at least, and was very enjoyable. He said a few trends we'll see pop up in later works here, like having multiple protagonists and doing the whole alternating chapter scheme where, you rotate perspective between different characters as your book goes along. Relatively common techniques. But it also introduces us to another common theme in Wight's works, an attempt to twist a trope or a traditional writing method in an interesting way. With this series, the twist is that the main character is not the prophesied hero. There actually is another character that is discovered to be the prophesied hero, so you're actually seeing this book from someone adjacent to the prophesied hero in this story. Of course, the main character of the story still does end up following a lot of the tropes for the prophesied hero, but within that world, they are not perceived as being the hero. The quality of writing, as would be expected in an author's early works, isn't Wight at his peak, but yet again, first book he published, it's pretty good. You have to give someone a little bit of a break. Like, you wouldn't read Stephen King's current works and go back to his first book or two and judge them on the same sort of critical scale you would anything that he's come out with in the last 3 or 4 years. There wasn't anything that stood out as horrible. As a matter of fact, these were the first books I read of his, and I absolutely loved them. I don't think he even had this series finished when I first read them. If I recall correctly, the first and I believe the second book were out and ended up having to wait for the third book. They are pretty simple, but in the sense that they are easy to follow rather than they lack depth. Elder Empire. Wight's second series, and delivered in an interesting way that I had not seen anyone else do. So, the twist on a traditional sort of trope or writing technique that he did for this series is that he actually published it as 2 parallel trilogies. So in other words, the first 2 books, which are meant to be read together, but with either one being first, are Of Sea and Shadow, with its partner book being named Of Shadow and Sea. This was an experimental way of releasing a series so that you could have 2 protagonists that star in their own books, but exist in the same story. Arguably, Wight could have released this as a trilogy and just had the alternate perspectives, which still exist in these books, but they stick more with Group A or Group B, and they don't really have any overlapping characters. The thing is, even if you did try to merge them, it would get a little bit complicated because the way the events actually overlap, they don't perfectly align with the way the timing in each book is set up. So it'd be really hard to squeeze certain events in, like you would have to have successive chapters fall within the same book and then start alternating between the other characters, so actually doing the layout would be a bit challenging. It actually works. It's probably pretty complicated, and I would imagine that's why I've not really seen him do it again. But it works. It made it interesting. Can someone please let me know down below if you know of another series that has done this, where 2 series actually run together at the same time. So now, onto the content more than the style of how they're published. The Sea books focus on a navigator, which is a person that can successfully sail what is an incredibly treacherous sea system. Think the line in One Piece. The character fits more in the pirate or rogue archetype pretty well, and his name is Calder. Calder is pretty charismatic and seems to have some interactions with an elder, which is basically a Lovecraftian entity, while he is trying to execute a complicated but entertaining scheme with his crew. The Shadows books, on the other hand, follow an assassin named Shara, as she navigates being a faceless tool for a shadowy organization. Her story slowly transforms from being a faceless tool to navigating through past traumas to develop her own path. I thought this series of books was incredibly fun to read through, though I will say you grow to like Calder much faster than Shara, but that may have more to do with the fact that her character is a lot more serious than Calder. You see a lot more trauma in the way her character is presented, and so that can be a little bit harder to kind of latch onto at first in a book, especially where that character is more standoffish than Calder was. And since Calder is written to be a charismatic character, that even translates through to the audience. Once you do start liking her, however, you grow to be as fond of her as you are of Calder, to the point where, when the two protagonists do come into conflict with each other, you find yourself pulling for whichever one is currently the main character of the book that you're reading. I didn't think that would actually happen the first time I swapped from a sea book to a shadow book because of how much I enjoyed Calder, but Wight does a good job of making them both relatable in their own books, but also capable of pissing you off, even if you know their motivations in the other books. What I mean by that is, while you're reading their story, you're rooting for them to succeed, but then when you switch to the other book and you understand what that person's trying to achieve, suddenly you're like, oh no, please don't ruin this character's goal. And it's interesting because while you were reading the opposing perspective, you definitely wanted them to get out on top. At the end of the day, I never found that I walked away from one book actually disliking the other character. I might have been irritated with them at the moment, but as soon as I switched back to their book, I was back to being on their team. The Last Horizon. I'm going to jump forward and mention the Last Horizon series really fast. These have come out at a point in my life where I've started getting busy enough that I haven't been able to read as much lately as I would like to. I haven't read this series yet, so I'm going to limit my comments and just mention that it's supposed to be more fantasy than sci-fi, even though it's set in space. So it's actual space wizards instead of just kind of space wizards. So I'm absolutely going to read it when I have the chance, just haven't really had the time to so far. Since I've never felt like my time was wasted with one of Wight's books, I'm not that worried about spending time reading it now. Cradle. Cradle is, at the moment, Wight's magnum opus and the thing that most people know him for. Cradle is what is called cultivation fantasy. I'm not going to even try to pronounce the proper Chinese name for this genre because that's where it was developed. I'll put it up on screen so you can see. So, as I mentioned, this is a fantasy genre originating from China, I believe, where a typically weak individual discovers some means of entering the world of cultivation. So, what is cultivation? Basically power levels from Dragon Ball Z, but with way more complicated methods of going from level to level, as well as way more potential levels of power. The Cradle series focuses mainly on Lyndon, a guy that starts out in a really remote village and has zero power, like literally zero power. He's actually called unsouled. In other words, they treat him like he has no soul because he can't tap into anything. Through a few interesting events, he meets a couple people from outside the village and manages to develop what's called a core. Having started out with no core, he believes he will consistently be weak, but across the dozen books of the series, he progressively gets stronger and stronger and consistently outperforms others. Yes, there's a dozen books in total. They were released at a rate that makes Wight the literal opposite of George R.R. Martin, with most years seeing up to 2 books drop within that one time frame. The number of years where only one dropped was actually less common than having 2 per year. As a bit of a side note, I don't believe Lyndon is safe from harm just because he's the main character and there's 12 books. I'm not going to disclose whether or not it happens within Cradle specifically, but one of the hallmarks of cultivation fantasy is that characters can potentially have their bodies completely destroyed and still figure out ways to come back to life. So Lyndon gets to go through all sorts of interesting events and meet a really wide variety of supporting characters across the series, all the while a massive background plot slowly develops that, for the first several books, barely has any impact on Lyndon in a direct way outside of sort of sparking his journey in the first book. This series is still straightforward and pretty easy to follow. Each individual book, as long as you read the previous ones and you remember what was in them, so like if you took a 2 or 3 year break, you might need to skim back through them to get a little bit of a refresher. But if you're reading them successively, everything is sort of stacked on in a way that makes sense. You know what the clear objective is from one book to the next, And it's really easy to follow, even though he's piling on a whole bunch of terminology and giving you a whole bunch of levels to go through. Now, if you listen to someone discussing, say, Book 11, you're probably not going to have any idea what's going on. But given the sheer number of books, the complexity in the lore is built up very naturally, and it's really not that hard to keep track of. This is by and large Wight's most popular series, though, as I tend to do with most authors, if you're interested in reading his works, I would suggest reading them in order of release. People do generally love Cradle, but like I mentioned, authors do get better the more they write. Wight has consistently improved in his writing capabilities across his career. If you read through the entire Cradle series, then go back and read his earlier works, you might find them lacking simply because you're used to his more refined writing style. The closest comparison I can think of is Sir Terry Pratchett and the Discworld series. And by comparison, I don't mean the general tone and style, because Discworld is nothing at all like Cradle. But if you have actually read through the Discworld series, if you know anything about it, it's that there's several points where you can just kind of jump in, read a book, and then jump back out. Like, there's multiple series within that universe. If you read some of the stuff that came later on, you can actually find it kind of hard to go back and read the earlier books. And I've known people that did that. Personally, when I decided to read them, I was aware of how popular of a series it was, so I just looked up a chart and read them in publication order. Now, I know a few people that didn't do that, and I've heard them mention that they read some of the later works and then just couldn't go back and read even some of his most famous ones like The Color of Magic. So, do yourself a favor. Whenever you're going to try an author, start out with their earlier works. Usually everything will be there that actually makes them turn into a good author, and you won't end up being disappointed by those books because it's going to be that person at their lowest capability. And if you like them at their lowest, you're absolutely going to like them as they develop. Now, I mean, I guess sometimes people change genres completely or just do something weird with the writings, but for the most part, if you can get through an author's earlier books, you're absolutely going to be able to get through their later ones. And that holds true here as well. I've seen a few reviews, because I was brushing up on the details of the books as I was actually putting this video together, where people have actually mentioned that they didn't care too much for his earlier works because they started out with Cradle, went back and tried to read the Traveler's Gate series, and just didn't like it. For me, I actually like Traveler's Gate better than I did Cradle, but that's largely because I started with it. And so you got a bit of a nostalgia factor there. I just really enjoy the theming of that series. I really enjoy the ideas that he presents. And so I like the way it was put together. That doesn't mean I think Cradle's bad. By all means, I actually think Cradle's a fantastic series. And it's one of those series that I would highly recommend people read at some point if they really enjoy fantasy. And if they're really curious about cultivation fantasy, because to be honest with you, it's the only Western cultivation fantasy I'm aware of. I don't have any idea if anyone else has done it. The only other Western thing I've seen for cultivation is actually a Seth Tinch video going over a cultivation simulator game. So you don't normally see too many Westerners talk about cultivation fantasy. But Wight did a really good job adapting the entire thing to Western sensibilities. Last thing to mention, there was actually a Kickstarter that got enough funding for an animation of some sort to go into production. The animation is going to be based around Cradle. I don't think it got enough funding for a full series, but I'm pretty sure a big enough animation is going to be produced that, if it's popular, it could pretty easily get the series sold to a bigger production company. If I recall correctly, he actually has someone that has worked for DC working with him to develop it, so that might throw a little bit more interest if you like anime into checking out Cradle. So, that's my review. Overall, I would highly recommend picking out at least one of Wight's series and giving it a shot. A link to Wight's author page will be in the description below. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Have a good night.